without energy, there's no heat.
Okay.
Or cold, because air conditioning depends on it too. So what we have here is, even though you might not think climate change is an important issue, and I don't either, as a matter of fact, because I don't know if I can do anything about it if I did.
I think it's a top 10. I don't think it's number one.
No, it's a top 10 in people's minds, but the real issue is energy, because the climate policy that is being adopted
That's
all
a better
around the
word.
world.
I'm with you there. I'm more on the energy side, but we have to pay attention to this, because if we don't pay attention to this could be an issue in the next 200 years.
But it's the energy side that I'm talking about being basically a suicide pact, the net zero thing. And the whole idea that we can end the use of fossil fuels without increasing nuclear energy, because the same people who are against all fossil fuel use are also against all nuclear energy. And that is the only technology that can actually replace fossil fuels as a reliable source 24/7. Hydroelectric is just as good, except there's flat places and dry places where there can't be any hydroelectric energy, whereas nuclear can be used anywhere from the North Pole to the equator, out on the oceans on a barge. You can put nuclear energy anywhere in the world. All you need to do is cool it with water or air, and you can have it there. So the Russians are floating barges down the rivers from the north in the Arctic to some of the cities that don't have a grid that are way up north, like they purposely developed up there, and they're bringing nuclear reactors in there. Russia, China, and India are all way ahead of the United States now in nuclear reactor technology. And Britain is even further ahead, too, in many ways. They've got Boeing there, not Boeing, sorry. I'm trying to think of the people who make really expensive cars. What is the most expensive British car?
Rolls-Royce.
Rolls-Royce, yes. Yeah. It's Rolls-Royce that has been building the submarine nuclear engines for UK fleet for 60 years or more. They know how to do it. And so the fact of the matter is, we could replace 50% of the fossil fuels in the next 30 years or 40 years with nuclear energy with no difficulty at all. But the idea that wind and solar are going to replace fossil fuels or nuclear or hydroelectric is absolutely insane. Can I just explain a little bit? When you have wind and solar, you have at most 1/3 of the time can you produce reliable energy. The sun goes down all night, it's no good early in the morning or the afternoon, and then the clouds come, right? So solar energy is more like 20% capacity. So 80% of the time it can't serve the grid, which is a demand for energy at certain times a day, a certain amount. The same with wind. The wind stops at night, the wind stops in the summer, the wind stops in the winter, the wind stops for 2 weeks at a time. The wind stops when the propellers freeze up. The wind stops when the wind blows too fast because they have to tether the blades. And so if you're going to use batteries instead of gas or coal or nuclear to back up the wind and solar, you have to build 3 times as much capacity in production. In other words, if you need 100 megawatts of coal energy, you need 300 megawatts capacity of wind and solar energy to charge the batteries, because you can't charge the batteries when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. But at the same time as you're charging the batteries, you have to be supplying the grid with the full amount of energy that it needs. So there's no technical feasibility study on this. There's no economic feasibility study on this. Mark Mills of the Manhattan Institute in New York is the expert. He's written 3 or 4 recent papers on how much material it's going to take. In terms of cement, the wind industry uses more than 100 times as much cement per unit of power produced as gas does. 100 times more cement. So the amount of fossil fuels that are required to build the wind and solar infrastructure makes wind and solar a parasite on the larger economy. That is a fair metaphor, a parasite. In other words, it's sucking wealth out of the system in order to support this stupid idea that wind and solar are renewable. Yes, the sun is renewable and the wind is renewable, but the infrastructure is not. The stuff they build isn't made out of plants. It's made out of steel and concrete and cadmium and aluminum and glass and lithium and cobalt and all these things. And if you look at the amount of material that has to go into a wind turbine compared to a gas plant, it's phenomenal. It means they have to mine vast amounts of ore and truck all this stuff everywhere. Huge machinery to put these things up and build them. So I've said that all the wind and solar infrastructure, onshore and offshore, should have to be built with wind and solar energy. In other words, they should not be allowed to use fossil fuels or nuclear or hydroelectric power to build the wind and solar infrastructure and then see how fast it disappears. It would be wiped off the face of the earth, and goodly so, because it is a parasite. And all these people are getting rich. All the crony capitalists are getting rich off the subsidies. First there are subsidies, then there are tax breaks, then there are mandates by utilities that politically are forcing the people to take the wind and solar when it's available, even though it costs more than the other technologies. It's a total mess. And this is the part of climate change that is worth paying attention to. The science of climate change, I cover it in my book thoroughly, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. The main reason that we have all these scare stories today is because there are a lot of things that are either invisible, carbon dioxide, radiation, whatever is supposed to be bad in GMOs, which actually doesn't exist because it doesn't have a name or a chemical formula, so therefore it's fake. But CO2 and radiation aren't fake. They're just invisible, so no one can see what they're doing. Then you have the remote things. Why are polar bears and coral reefs the main icons here? Because no one can see what they're doing, right? So they say 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is nearly dead, is practically dead, is bleached, is in its final terminal stage. None of those mean dead, of course. They make it like practically dead. It means it's going to die, right? No, it doesn't. Things come back from being practically dead, like coral reefs. And they weren't practically dead in the first place. That was all hype anyways. Polar bear population has grown by 4 to 5 times in the last 50 years. I ask big audiences of professional people, how many of you have heard of the international treaty signed in 1973 by all the polar nations ending the unrestricted hunting of polar bears? No one's ever heard of it. No one ever talks about it. They don't want you to know about that because that treaty, on the advice of wildlife biologists to the leaders of those countries around the pole, that has caused a 3 to 5 times increase in polar bear populations. To this day, where now the people who live up in the polar bear region, in Canada it's Nunavut and then it's Greenland and Norway, those people in Nunavut, which is Canada has the most polar bears of anybody because we have so many islands up there in the Arctic. Those people have passed a polar bear management plan 2 years ago because they think there's too many polar bears because they're eating people and they are breaking into houses and there's just too many of them. They've grown so much. And yet not one newspaper in Canada or the United States reported that polar bear management plan or report the treaty that was signed in 1973.
So if you like this clip and you want to watch another one, click right here. And if you want to watch the entire podcast, click right here.